recording for those that are signed in and can't quite make the time. So guys, I want to kick off with a couple of stats that have come out of the Corporate Executive Board. Love their work, love their data collection. 84% of learning and development solutions are satisfying, according to their survey from last year. So this is managers that are finding what the solutions that learning and development are providing to organizations are satisfying. So on one hand, we've got some real great success. People are happy with what we're doing. But despite this, an estimated 145 billion spent annually on training, less than half of that investment goes to tangible returns. So that concerns me as a learning and development professional as to whether we're actually getting the returns that we need from the investment that organizations are making in learning and development. Let's look at another stat. Again, coming out of the Corporate Executive Board, 27%, HR and line managers, in order to keep up with the performance required to meet their targets and growth, say they need a 27% increase in performance. And so in a way, that's the perfect opportunity for them to be partnering with learning and development, helping them with performance increasing initiatives. However, with the current way we're approaching it with the learning and development, the survey says that we will only get a 3 to 5% increase in performance. So what does this tell us? This tells us what we're doing at the moment currently isn't enough to deliver what organizations require. And finally, 2010 McKinsey report, Getting More Out of Your Training Programs. Of all the managers surveyed, only 25% felt that the training programs that were being delivered measurably improved business results. I'd ask you to sit and consider for a second, can you relate in your organization? Are we, as learning and development professionals, delivering the results that organizations need to see within learning? And I think it's perplexing because when I look around the industry, I can see amazing work being done. So we know that there's great work being done. The challenge is it creating the business results required? And this is where learning transfer comes in, and why I'm going to be talking with you today about learning transfer. So just pause for a moment to consider what learning transfer means to you. And you may want to put that in the chat box. Tracy, thank you for finding the chat box. Lovely to have you here from Rockville, Maryland, USA. That's just to remind you, if you move your cursor, there will be a little pop-up floating bar. If you can't see chat on there, click the more on the end and chat will be one of those options. So do feel free to come into the chat box. I think it's great if we can liaise through the chat as we go through this webinar today. And I'd also suggest to you guys, I know it's mid to late afternoon, probably where you are in the USA. It's 6 a.m. here in Australia, beautiful morning. I'd really encourage you to take this time as you're here on the webinar to perhaps close down other windows. Tracy, thank you, 2 p.m. to close down other windows and really get stuck into learning transfer just for the next 45, 50 minutes, 1 hour, to immerse yourself in the topic and to see what value we can create for you. And I'm also happy to answer questions either as we go through or towards the end of the session. No visibility on other work. I'm just suggesting people get really engaged with the topic. So thank you guys. Great. So why learning transfer? Well, let's kick off with a definition of learning transfer. The ability of a learner to successfully apply the behaviour, skills and knowledge acquired through learning to the job with a resulting improvement in job performance. Quite a mouthful, but we need to make sure everything's covered. But if we look down at the basics, it means the learning plus application giving us improved performance is learning transfer. And I think, as we all know, the biggest challenge within that is the application. So learning transfer is what's going to give us those results that will improve the performance for our organisations from the investment that we're already creating in learning. And let's think about the other big trend across learning and development professionals, learning and development divisions, talent divisions. Numbers, big data, analytics, measurements, evaluation. Whose organisation is crying out for more of these from their learning and development initiatives? Again, if you want to engage in the chat box, you're very welcome. Or if you want to reflect for yourselves. But certainly the trend we're seeing is to needing more data, numbers, analytics. And sometimes I feel that as learning and development professionals, we're often trying to pull the proverbial rabbit out of the hat when we're getting our numbers and our data together. And I sort of see that we have the learning intervention, whatever that looks like, whether it's a program, whether it's online, whether it's over a period of time, then wave a magic wand and we have the results pop out the other end in terms of our evaluation. And often what I hear from learning and development professionals is in that period between the learning and seeing whether there has been an impact and what that impact has been, they kind of feel their hands are tied. And that really once the learning is back in the business, it's very difficult for learning and development to have that influence over the success of a program or an initiative. Absolutely, Tracy. Tracy's just sharing, for those that can't see the chat box, the statistics are needed to even justify current efforts and evaluate whether more innovative approaches are needed or valuable. Exactly. So the analysis and the information to actually have that conversation and really look at what's the requirement, essential to get that information. But a lot of the time, what I see is when people are trying to gather that information, what they're trying to see is whether the improved performance has happened, perhaps without necessarily taking efforts to deliver that improved performance because of the perceived lack of control and because of this issue of feeling our hands are tied. So I just want to share an analogy with you all for a moment. Let's have a think about the humble smartphone, if we can call a smartphone something as humble. I want you to imagine that you are involved in the design, the development, the manufacture, the production. You're involved in the smartphone in some way. And it doesn't matter what your role is, but it's all part of getting the smartphone to market, selling it to your customers. And your customers absolutely love it. It's a fantastic piece of technology. It's doing great work. But let's just imagine for a second, rather than sell a smartphone and a charger, you just sell the smartphone. Now, no matter how much effort you have put into the design of that smartphone, to the functionality of the smartphone, no matter how great the production was of the smartphone, unless you sell it with a charger, the benefits and the magnificence of the smartphone are going to be very, very short-lived. And when I look at learning and development, I sometimes feel that we are selling the smartphone without the charger. We're giving them the program or the initiative without necessarily the learning transfer. And it's the learning when it's applied, when it's transferred, that's going to get the improved performance. Just wondering if that resonates with anyone. Take a moment to think. Again, if you want to pop into the chat box, very welcome. Lovely to have a couple of more people joining us. We're thinking about the analogy of the smartphone, the charger, and learning transfer. Now, of course, it's not always that black and white. Wouldn't it be lovely if things were just that simple? But today I'd love us to have a little bit of a deep dive into learning transfer to see where our initiatives can help improve performance, can help get better results for organizations through really focusing on transfer. So deep diving, who's seen lots of different words for the description of learning transfer being bandied around at the moment? So we might call it retention of learning, learning reinforcement, sustaining the learning, embedding the learning, transferring the learning. If there's any others people have seen, feel free to pop those into the chat box. Guys, I'm really just, thank you, Tracy, knowledge sharing. Interesting one, yes, knowledge sharing. And that came up on LinkedIn with someone asking a question about knowledge transfer as well. And are knowledge transfer and is learning transfer the same thing? We will come on to that. Guys, if there's anyone else that's having, that wants to nip in the chat box, feel free. If you're having Zoom issues, the only way I can find about that is through the chat box. But just to confirm, so if you move the cursor, it'll either be at the top of your screen, at the bottom of your screen. As you move the cursor, a floating bar will come up. So often people think, oh, where is that panel? It's because it's hidden. And it only comes up when you move the cursor either at the top of the screen or bottom of the screen for your bar to come up. Great. So when we're looking at all these descriptions, adding in knowledge sharing, knowledge management, knowledge transfer, if we go back to basics, 2 parts to learning: skills and knowledge, and behavioural change. So if we think about that as our learning framework, skills and knowledge and behavioural change, it comes down to the very basics of what we know and what we do. And so when we're looking at those descriptions and we're thinking about transfer, the transfer is no longer about just knowing something. It's actually about applying or doing something. And that's where the behavioural change, the doing piece comes in. So when I'm looking at the different words that we use within the learning and development profession at the moment, I sense check it through. Are we talking about what we know or remember? Or are we talking about what we physically do and the behavioural outcome that we get as a result? So in terms of knowledge transfer, often it's just about the knowing. Does this person know how to do a particular task? Do they know how to solve a particular problem? And then whether they actually use that knowledge or not is what will actually give them the outcome. So I could remember how to do something. I could have the retention or the knowledge of a particular model, you know, the 3-step process for effective performance reviews. But whether in the heat of the moment I actually use that process in my performance reviews, that's the difference between retaining the information and actually applying or transferring the learning. And so, Tracy, with knowledge sharing, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's almost implied. What are your thoughts? Is that about knowing, as the name kind of knowledge suggests, or is it the doing or the results and the outcomes? Feel free if anyone would like to contribute. Let's just take a moment to think about this. Are we talking about what we know or what we do? Yeah, I think there is a distinction between knowing or doing, and it really comes down into the languaging and the communication that you have when you're talking with people about your transfer and your results. But certainly, a lot of the time when people are talking about reinforcement, it's actually all about the knowledge and all about reinforcing what people have learned, not necessarily about actually getting the end result. And that's an interesting point, Tracy. Tracy's sharing that knowledge should motivate others to demonstrate what is learned. So, and with the dangerous word in there being should. And I sometimes think about it in terms of a behavioural change piece. And, if we look at something like smoking or healthy eating, we all know that smoking is inherently bad for us and for people. And this isn't to kind of call out smokers, because obviously it's a choice that everyone has. But I think we could say that we all know now that it's actually a damaging choice. Yet knowing that doesn't necessarily motivate us to change our behaviours. And this is really the key distinction with learning transfer, to think about. It's all very well knowing the learning, but are we putting it into place? So the bottom line is we're talking about behavioural change and actually creating that behavioural change post-learning. And what I would say is, let's not get overwhelmed and suddenly think, oh goodness, I've got something else to do as part of my learning portfolio. This is really an opportunity, because I think when we really start to get learning transfer and start to get the results from the learning initiatives we're putting together, it takes us to a whole different level of conversation with businesses and organizations. So I say to people, keep calm and think transfer. So with learning transfer, we break it down into 3 separate steps. And this is our turning learning into action model. Now, there are other learning transfer models, and so feel free to, equate this to your own particular model. But most learning transfer models will have sort of at least 3 stages, or be able to be broken down into the 3 stages. So I'm just going to call these out here so we can consider how they work. 3 stages: the preparation, preparing for the transfer; the action, which is actually happens over a period of time and is the section where the transfer or the real magic happens; and then the evaluation, when we collect the data. And what I'd love to draw your attention to is that this 3-stage process here, preparation, action, and evaluation, happens after the learning initiative. So once the knowledge and the skills, and probably attitudes in most soft skills trainings as well, are actually shared, learnt, gathered, once they've got that learning, it's then how do we start to apply it? And it's through this 3-step or 3-step process. Now, the majority of today, we're going to be talking about, well, what actually happens in the action phase. And to create transfer, I believe that's where we need to have follow-up conversations. So we're going to be going into in a lot of detail today what needs to happen in the action phase. But I also want to touch on the preparation phase, because I see that as being very important to the success of the action phase. Now, most learning programs have some kind of action plan in them. Again, guys, I don't know if anyone else wants to nip into the chat box, but the more questions we have, the easier it will be for me to ensure that you're getting what you need from today. So if you have questions, thoughts, or comments, please pop into the chat. I'd love to ensure that this is being really useful to you today. And I'd also love to hear what people do for action planning in their programs at the moment. What I see from many of the organizations that I work with, all programs, when they're put together, have an action planning element in them. I think it would be very, very rare to have a program that doesn't have action planning. And yet, what I also see is that in many, many cases, when a program or initiative is executed back into a business, the action planning is compromised. And the action planning is compromised by being rushed, or being done by at the very end of the program, or the action planning being part of a feedback form. And so people feel at an action planning stage that it's the end of the process and they're just signing off. Whereas the action plan is actually the beginning of the most exciting phase of the learning, which is starting to apply it back in the workplace. So I feel there's a real call to arms that we can do as a learning and development profession around action planning that could almost be a separate webinar in itself. Leslie, thanks for popping into the chat box. Lovely to have you here. Accountability piece is hard. We're absolutely going to go on to that, Leslie. And my experience is once we can get the proper process behind it, it becomes a whole lot easier. And agreed, tracking and monitoring isn't rewarding for anyone. But actually creating the behavioural change is what's going to create that shift. So let's delve further into that. Just to finish off on action planning before we do, what I'd love to share with you, and I'm just kind of looking at some slides that I've got to print out here and not exactly the next slide coming up. Interesting. I've got a copy of an action plan that I'm really happy to share, and we can work out how to get that to people at the end with just a simple email. The action planning, the clearer we get on the action planning, the better our results will be. So happy to share that with you, an example action plan, because the action plan is what will come in to the action conversations. So when people complete action plans at the end of a learning initiative, my encouragement is that they are either, copied on someone's smartphone, scanned, and then a copy of that action plan then goes to the person who will be having follow-up conversations. Now, that may be the manager. It may be an internal task force that's looking after your learning transfer. It may be external. But it's that particular document that we use to anchor the process throughout. And Leslie, to your point of accountability, in order to hold people accountable, and we'll talk about that more in a moment, you need to have a baseline of what people are being held accountable to. And that's where the action planning piece comes in. That's where people are actually making a decision in terms of what they want to put into place. So that's driven through the preparation stage. Now, also at the preparation stage, you'll be going through how the conversation's going to happen, where they happen, the timing of the follow-up conversations. So there's a whole host of logistics that happens here in order to set this action phase up for success. So as we go through the action phase, in terms of a follow-up conversation, what I'd love to share with you is what really enables that follow-up conversation, follow-up process to work. And sorry, Tracy just wants to check in on something before we proceed. So Tracy, in terms of example of preparation activities, I would say it's getting clear on all the logistics for the follow-up action process, getting people clear on the actions they're going to commit to. And I can share that action plan with you. We get people to confirm what it is they want to implement, when they'll have it implemented by, why it's important to them, because the why is often more important than the goal itself, getting people clear on their why. What does success look like? So again, this is all things that they capture on the action plan. And calibration on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you on that particular item? And then finally, what's the immediate next step? So what's the immediate steps that people are going to take as they leave the learning environment? And Tracy, when we give out the action plans at the end, I can send copies to people. Those 5 will be kind of in there clearly. So that will be a little bit easier to follow. But good question. Really important to get that preparation stage clear. So the ingredients for successful follow-up conversations and for follow-up process. The first thing is that conversation needs to be about reflection to create change, not content that acts as a reminder. So if we go back to our initial model of the difference between knowing and doing, a lot of the time people try and do learning transfer and learning transfer follow-up by sending out a video of perhaps what the content was, or sending out an article, or reminding people of a particular model. In order to create behavioural change, you need to get people to reflect. You need to get people thinking about what's working and what's not working. You need to get people thinking about how are they tracking against the commitments that they have made. So very much learning transfer, the more we can make it about reflection rather than reminders, the more useful it will be to people, and the more you will actually start to create that behavioural change rather than just churning out more content and more information. And we all know that information is so readily available right now, whether we're using Google, whether we've got our internal portals. People are not short of information. They're short of slowing down, reflecting, and really thinking about what the impact is and what's working and what isn't. So any learning transfer process you put in place, you need to really anchor it in reflection. And that's what a learning transfer conversation needs to be about. Again, if anyone has any thoughts or any experience of that, please feel free to go into the chat box, move your cursor to the edge of your screen to have the floating bar pop up and nip into the chat. So our first ingredient is thinking about reflection to create change rather than content to create reminders. The second part, and Leslie, this is to your point, that needs to be created through the follow-up conversations, is holding people accountable. Now, often accountability within organizations can be a little bit of a dirty word, and I think it's because accountability is often associated with sort of a wagging finger. Now, for learning transfer, we need to be thinking about a new type of accountability, holding someone accountable to themselves. And that's why we choose here the image of the guy looking in the mirror. He's not being held accountable to his manager. He's not being held accountable to his organization. You're helping him hold himself accountable to what he has chosen to put into place at the end of the learning program. And obviously, the way you structure the learning program will lend itself to the items that people actually put on their action plan. But it works on the belief that each individual knows their role and their skill set and their strengths the best. And so the more that you can get them to take accountability and to really take ownership for putting things into place, then the better learning transfer you will have. Now, taking ownership and accountability doesn't mean leaving them to do it all themselves, because a lot of the time, to have some way to help us hold ourselves accountable is what will actually create that change. And often what we find is when we have a follow-up conversation scheduled, it'll often be the day before that the person actually takes action or follows through, because they know that they've got to report back the next day. That's just the nature of accountability. But the important thing is it's not being done in a nagging fashion, because the minute you try and nag someone into behavioural change, it's just a very, very long journey. So that's about holding the individual accountable to themselves through them driving the action plan, driving what they want to change, and driving the process. And remembering this is all a model that works around specific follow-up conversations. So the third ingredient that we need to think about when we're putting together our follow-up conversations and putting together our learning transfer strategies is to make it specific to the individual. A lot of the time in organizations, when we're thinking about learning, we will be thinking about, maybe the May 2016 cohort. And that might be 15 people that went through a particular program or initiative in May. Even if that's a 6 months or a year-long initiative, you may well kind of label them the May group. Now, when it comes to learning transfer, you need to start thinking at a specific, really individual level. It's no good thinking about them as a cohort. It's about, has each individual person done an action plan? Is each individual person having follow-up conversations? Have they got a follow-up schedule? Oh, excuse me, everyone. And Leslie, to your point in terms of tracking and monitoring, I actually think that when you can get people being held accountable to themselves, it becomes less about tracking and monitoring and more about supporting. But there does need to be robust logistics around it. And I think it's often the logistics which put people off the whole learning transfer process. And what I would say is, don't be afraid of the logistics. It's just a case of getting really organized and really clear to enable this to run smoothly for you. I was chatting with another company that was working in learning transfer, broadly in the learning transfer space the other day, and they said they were really struggling and were only having 20% of people actually engage in the transfer process. And I know that it's very possible to get 80 to 85%. I mean, our minimum is 80. Our average is around 88% of people actually engaged in the follow-up process. But the way to do that is to get really clear on your logistics and work at it at a very specific person level rather than thinking of it as a cohort. So I hope that makes sense to people. And I hope that's a useful tip when you're planning your learning transfer initiatives. So next step, when you're having the learning transfer conversations, whether it's the manager, whether it's someone on an internal task force, whether it's someone from learning and development, whether it's someone externally, the important things for these follow-up conversations is to change your hat. Now, what I mean by changing the hat is that if a manager is, for example, is having a regular weekly one-on-one with their person, and at the end of the conversation, they say, "Oh, how did you go on the training program? Tell me what you learned on the leadership program. What was your experience?" Throwing that comment in at the end of another conversation, at the end of a regular one-on-one, it's going to be very different to create the distinctive, reflective type of conversation rather than just a regular task-focused conversation. So what I really encourage people to do when you're having the follow-up conversation is change your hat. Now, it may be that you just need to change your hat for 20 minutes and go into your learning transfer mode. It's a learning transfer conversation. It's a very different type of reflective conversation. But if you try and do that conversation when you've got your regular hat on of either your manager or your learning and development person, it's very difficult. And again, this is all to do with the clearer you can make the process and the logistics, the easier it is to create the outcomes. So changing hats, very important ingredient to creating successful learning transfer. So number 5, the telephone. So we kind of call the telephone our secret weapon on the team here. The telephone is all about A, being efficient, and B, getting people to have this reflective conversation with themselves rather than have the conversation with the other person. As people reflect with themselves, it supports this whole idea of them holding themselves accountable rather than being held accountable to the other person. And that creates much more long-term sustained change. The conversation on the telephone goes straight into the ear, into the heart, into the body. It's a very, very efficient way of having that internal reflection. And also the telephone encourages people to be vulnerable. Now, especially when we're talking about soft skills learning transfer, people often have to really look inside themselves and really be honest with themselves what's working and what isn't. And so the more people can be vulnerable, the more they will open up and share. It also means those conversations can be really efficient. So my experience is that 30 minutes on the telephone, you can go as deep as you might do if you sat doing a 90 minutes reflection with someone face to face. So I would really say, think about the telephone as an option when you're doing your learning transfer solutions. Also really useful for when you have people spread out over large geographic areas. Also useful when you have people that travel a lot. And of course, cut down on your travel expenses for getting people together face to face. Any thoughts or comments on the telephone, please feel free to jump in the chat box. Again, if you've got any questions, feel free to ask those as we go along. So, oh, we're going the wrong way. Phasing. This is the next ingredient for successful learning transfer. So when we talk about phasing, we're talking about the phasing of the follow-up conversations you're having. And Tracy, thanks again for popping into the chat box. While you can take your hat off, the other person may still see you as the manager. And Tracy, I think there's a really interesting kind of conversation to be had as to, is the manager the best person to be having the learning transfer conversation? And for me, I think it all depends on the learning initiative and the types of change that you're trying to get. And if you are working with the manager as the learning transfer conduit, there needs to be really clear signposting and even clearer changing of the hat for that particular conversation. Often you perhaps won't get the level of vulnerability for the participant when they're working with the manager, but it is better than nothing. But it really does require different expectations being set of the manager. Yeah, I would, and Tracy's just put in the chat box for those that can't see the chat box, perhaps being a mentor or a coach. Often someone with a mentor or a coach will get a higher level of vulnerability to create that behavioural change in a faster, more efficient way. And so partly it's around choosing your initiatives in terms of which initiatives you're going to invest in at which level for your learning transfer. And I think that starts to drive that conversation. If we have time at the end, certainly we can dive into a little bit more on that, Tracy, as to how we choose our initiatives. So let's just think about the phasing of the conversations, though. You need to keep the tension tight enough to keep the momentum. So you need to keep the phasing of the conversations close enough together that the momentum happens, but loose enough for it to become self-sustaining. So typically we might work with people having, say, 3 30-minute conversations over a 10 to 12 week period. And typically they will start closer to the participant and closer to the program, and then just ease our way out. So that's 3 30 minutes over a 10 to 12 week period, creating a significant difference in learning transfer. And that's through getting that phasing of that conversation correct. Okay, number 7. Possibly we could say, is this 3 ingredients: monitoring, managing, and measuring. So one of the things we know from experience is that without some kind of measurement or analysis or information being captured, the conversations often won't happen. Or we don't know whether those conversations have happened. We don't know the quality of those conversations. So it's really important to find a way of tracking, monitoring the follow-up conversations. And certainly one of the measurements that we use, and this is an example dashboard that we put together. It's lovely if you can tie your learning initiatives back to the KPIs of the business and back to KPIs that are already collected. That would be my first preference. That all depends on the type of program you're running, the data that's available to you, what options you have. But failing that, if you can't link back to initial KPIs, you can always use self-rating scores. So you'll see here two different graphs. They're both done self-rating, and getting the people to rate each particular goal on a scale of 1 to 10 at the start of the implementation or the start of the transfer, and then where do they get to at the end of the transfer. And sometimes we can have the manager corroborating those scores as well to see where they have come along. But really important to get some kind of monitoring, managing, measuring piece in place. And although this dashboard here, I'm not sure whether people feel it looks complex or not, it's really, really simple to do. We just have some sort of level 1 questions here in terms of satisfaction, NPS, if that's something your organisation works with. We have a pie chart of the areas that the goals fell into. So the actions that people are setting themselves, how does that align perhaps with a competency model, or how does it align with the program objectives of the different areas we were working on? Just captured in a pie chart form. So this one is pretty even. Obviously we have had programs perhaps where over a 3-day leadership initiative, perhaps half a day spent on finance, but when we actually look at the actions, no one was taking anything away from that finance section to put into place. So for that particular program, the finance was dropped from the core curriculum, and for those that needed the finance piece, that was given as a separate half day. So, gathering information around what people are actually putting into place can help you, of course, with your program design and improve your initiative anyway. And then, of course, we've just captured some word clouds about the changes that people have put into place and the business benefits. So I wanted to just put in a few stats of the type of results that we have. And again, and I'm sure people have got their own transfer results, their own way of measuring it. We did a stack up at around 3,000 people. They were reporting a 79% improvement in transferring their skills post the Turning Learning to Action coaching process. And participants reported a 57% improvement in their ability to achieve their objectives as a result of the follow-up process. So they were saying they were 57% more likely to have got their outcomes than if they hadn't had any follow-up at all. And happy to share more results offline if people would like more information. So I obviously look at everything through my sort of rose-coloured spectacles of learning transfer, and would love to see a time where we have learning transfer involved in all programs. But really very much it is about picking which initiatives are going to give you the biggest return and outcome. And I'm really happy to, I have a diagnostic process that I can go through with people. Usually takes about an hour, 90 minutes on the phone, and we really look at what you're doing internally and which initiatives are going to give you the biggest win and the easiest win for your learning transfer results. So if you'd like to have one of those diagnostic conversations, very happy for people to reach out. I've already also put together some more resources, which is today's key takeaways, chapter from my book, the action plan template that we spoke about earlier, and a readiness questionnaire. So do feel free to just send an email to resources@leverlearning.com. So that's resources@leverlearning.com, and they will pop immediately by return email into your inbox, those more resources. Guys, we're coming up to Q2, so I have allowed time for questions. Any questions, thoughts, or comments? I'd love to know how people could perhaps see learning transfer working for their organisation, or if there's initiatives that you've already got learning transfer that's working for that's perhaps taking a bit of a different approach. Feel free to pop into the chat box. It's always slightly challenging when it's chat rather than audio. So feel free if anyone has any questions that they would like to pop in with. Of course, you're very welcome to come and ask questions, and engage with me offline as well. Yeah, Tracy, good observation. So Tracy shares that learning transfer in her organisation is not such a full-blown initiative. So the fact there are strategies to incorporate is great. And very much, Tracy, that's around kind of picking your battles, I think. So yes, it's you're not necessarily going to have learning transfer across everything, but think about what strategies are going to work for which particular projects. And often if you can get a hero project and really deliver transfer for that particular project, the organisation will start to see the role of learning elevated, the role of learning starting to show more value. And then that can help you with the deeper level of conversations that you have with the organisation about the value that learning can really offer. So we're really committed to helping people elevate learning through successful transfer, because the more we can kind of grow our people, grow our organisations, obviously the better contribution that we can all make. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I am going to close off there. My commitment is not just to data dump to people, but to give you really things that you can think about and apply. But do feel free to engage with me offline. And I really wish you well in terms of your learning transfer and your support initiatives. Again, resources at leverlearning.com, and you will get those additional resources. Thanks, everyone, for your time today. I really appreciate it. Very best wishes.